We think women need to talk more openly about money because money really matters. It shouldn't be embarrassing or confusing. Join the conversation. We'll be discussing a whole range of topics which will help you get comfortable with your finances. Money Matters. Brought to you by AJ Bell.
Hello, everyone. We are back with another episode of the AJ Bell Money Matters podcast. I'm Laura, and together with Danni, we hope to help women like all of you feel more confident and more comfortable with your finances, and to help you through some of the noise and jargon that can make many of us feel slightly overwhelmed. Isn't that right, Danni?
That is absolutely right, Laura. Hello, everyone. I think that now more than ever, helping people understand some of the basic terms that are being used to talk about the economy in general all the time and how it impacts our own personal finances, why taxes might be heading up at the next budget. It's so important to give people the foundations for that. So with that in mind, our special guest this week is Zoe Burt, a former wealth manager and co-founder of My Financial Freedom Coach. We asked her to take us right back to basics, to give us a kind of economics 101 when it comes to some of the terms like gross domestic product or GDP. I'm sure you'll have heard that quite a lot. Don't worry, Laura. I know you hate jargon. She's going to bust that down a bit later on. And she's also going to explain how the UK's economy impacts our own economies. So stay tuned for that.
But as usual, we cover a one big thing every week where we explain something that's happening either in the news or that's related to your finances and really break it down and de-jargon it. And this week felt like a really good time to talk about cybersecurity, because it seems every month there's a new report of a big company becoming the victim of a cyber attack, which sees some customer data stolen. Now, obviously, this doesn't necessarily directly impact your finances, but if you get your data stolen and then that's sold on to scammers, then it can have a big impact on your finances. Over the past few months, we've seen Marks and Spencer, Co-op, Harrods and Jaguar Land Rover all affected to varying degrees. It's important to note that all of these companies have said passwords and payment details have not been compromised, but it is a worrying time if you're a customer. So if you're worried about your personal details, what should you do? Well, I think the first thing, and, might be slightly obvious, is to be really cautious. And I think this has been drummed into quite a lot of us now. When you're opening attachments to emails, be really cautious and avoid opening them if you aren't expecting that email. That's the same for clicking on links in emails, especially those that are asking you for personal data. So the way it works is hackers are relying on you slipping up as we rush through life. So you're checking your emails on your phone, on the commute, having just done the school drop-off, and you're not properly focusing, and that is what they're relying on, those kind of pinch points in life. And in cybersecurity, it's split into type 1 and type 2 thinking. We're getting sciencey now, Danni. So type 1 is fast, automatic and intuitive. So this is relying on habits and emotions to quickly form judgment. And then on the other hand, type 2 is slow, deliberate and logical and requires conscious effort to analyze information. Scammers are hoping that you see a familiar name online and click on a link without checking the actual email address, or handing over bank details because your bank called to verify them after a purchase, even though logically we know that wouldn't normally happen. So they're looking to really capitalize on that type 1 thinking where you're kind of rushing through and not methodically thinking about things. So there's things that you can do to try and help prevent that. Don't be afraid of telling your bank that you want to call them back, and then you can go to their website and get a number for customer services from there and call them back yourself. And of course, remember that your bank will never ask for your PIN or your entire security number or password. You should check all of your accounts for any unauthorized activity, and it's always worth changing passwords regularly, and definitely changing passwords for accounts that you think might have been impacted by a cyber attack. This is a biggie that I sometimes fall foul of. Do not repeat passwords, and also make sure that any passwords you have are strong, so not obvious. I don't want anyone out there using password 123.
I really struggle remembering passwords, I have to say. And every time I change my password and it seems obvious and I think, yeah, no problem, I'm going to remember that, I don't. And then I have to go running back to the IT desk and saying, help me, because I've forgotten it, which is not good. But it does at least mean that I'm safe and secure. And you were talking then about type 2 people who are a bit more slow, methodical, or certainly sometimes you're type 1, but sometimes you can be type 2. And you're looking at the emails that you get through and you think, well, I can spot a scam. The grammar is terrible, or, some of the words, the syntax just doesn't work quite well. But with the rise of AI, it's easier than ever now for scammers to put that text through platforms like ChatGPT, and they can then get the grammar perfect. So it's becoming even harder to be able to spot a scam instantly. So there are things called large language models, and they read huge amounts of text and then mimic your tone and be able to write then convincing messages based on your hobbies. So I think the key is, if it looks too good to be true, or maybe if a friend messages you out of the blue, or, you maybe don't recognize the number or the email attached to that friend, but it seems like they are your friend, then it is always safest to contact them separately just to check that if it is really them. And I think you also have to be really careful about the stuff that you're putting online. I remember sitting my kids down when they started high school and just talking about, uniform logos and sharing addresses. And my husband is huge about making sure that he rips the address off every envelope, letter, parcel, and puts them through a shredder. And it's kind of the same thing. If you think about what you're putting out there on social media pages, you can actually inadvertently be sharing a huge amount of information about your life, your likes, the kind of, activities that you do, where you live. And one of the Money Matters members was saying earlier that when she bought her first home earlier this year, instead of taking a picture of the front door with the house number to celebrate, she took a photograph of the inside so that, you can't immediately tell where it is that she is living. And although she was saying, well, it kind of feels like overkill, maybe, it just was a way to make sure that she felt safe and secure. And I know that there can be times when you get emails through, and you and I have both fallen for this the last week or so. You get an email through that actually you do need to click on, you do need to fill in, but you delete without even checking because you're so hyper vigilant. And then you get an email saying, can you please make sure you go back and do that?
I know, and that is the danger, isn't it? That you become so hyper vigilant that you end up missing genuine emails that you do need to action. And if that's just something trivial, then it doesn't matter so much. But if it's something important, like pay a request to pay a bill or a fine, or other things that you might get emails about, and then that can be tricky. So it's a fine balance, but I think it is getting really hard now, isn't it? Like you say, scammers are using AI. There's loads of really quite scary technologies in terms of them being able to impersonate phone numbers. And it is really tricky to spot scams and not go too far the other way and just delete every email that comes into your inbox for fear of being scammed. So it is a balance.
Be nice and quiet though, wouldn't it?
It would be. Think that would be such a nice working day. Anyway, both M&S and Co-op were hit with what are called ransomware attacks. So this is where hackers encrypt files on a computer and lock up your system and then demand a ransom to give you access back. To help protect yourself at home from a similar kind of attack, then you should have software on your home computer that's kept up to date. You should use high quality antivirus software, and which also recommends setting up a restore point on your computer so that it can be restored from safe mode. And then you can do this by searching restore point on your device. And as we've said, if in doubt, be suspicious. You can always hang up or delete the message or email and then get in touch with the company another way. And who knows, you could help protect other people from scams as well.
Yeah, and to that end, do make sure that you report anything that is suspicious. Don't just delete it and forget about it. There is loads of information on the National Cybersecurity Centre website about how to make reports, what to do if you're worried about something. And remember that you're not alone. I mean, I was astonished. I was looking on the NCSC website, and it was saying that it had received more than 45 million reports of scams up until August 2025. That is a lot of scams.
That is a lot, particularly when you consider that not everyone is going to be reporting every scam. So that's kind of like the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? There will be vastly more scams that people have spotted and just not reported, or just deleted and not thought about reporting it. But let's move on to our guest interview this week, because I'm sure if you've been watching the news or looking at any news websites lately, you will have spotted stories about the state of the UK economy and why the government might have to put up taxes in the budget later in the year. So there's so much speculation, and we're not going to get into that just yet, although I'm sure we will be bringing you budget news closer to the date. But we wanted to help you understand what's going on, because there's often a lot of jargon used and it can be really hard to know what matters to us as individuals. So we asked Zoe Burt to break it all down for us. She's a former wealth manager, a co-founder of My Financial Freedom Coach, and you can also find her on Instagram. She is at Words on Wealth. And I promise she takes us right back to basics. There's a lot of jargon busting here to really explain these terms to you.
Fab. Well, let's start with the basics, Zoe, because the wider economy, a lot of people hear stories about the economy, and what does it mean to us as individuals?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it can sound quite far removed, I think, from us and our lives. But really, the economy affects everything we do, from like how easy it is to get a job, how likely we are to stay in our jobs if we're potentially at risk of losing it, how much things cost when we go to the supermarket, how far we can get our money to stretch, how much tax we pay. It underpins what we're able to do with our money and, of course, our relevant employment, self-employment, businesses on a day-to-day basis. Kind of touches everything.
Yeah, because we often hear when we're talking about the economy about the size of the economy, about how fast it's growing, whether it's growing at all. And we often hear then the term GDP. So we don't like jargon here. So let's break down GDP. What does that mean?
Yeah, of course. I think there's one too many acronyms in the economic and financial world, right? But GDP stands for gross domestic product, which I don't know if that helps or not, because to me, they're just three words pushed together. But essentially what that is all goods and services produced by a country. So every country in the world will measure their GDP. So if you wanted to dig into it, the exact calculation takes into account lots of different things, from government spending, investments, wages, but it also takes into account imports and exports. It minuses them together to get GDP. So normally it's quoted to as some sort of percentage, because what people really want to know is how much it's growing. So you can look at the actual figure, and the UK's is over the trillion mark. But with numbers that big, it almost becomes irrelevant. So it's that percentage that we see most frequently.
Yeah. So we hear talk about the economy is contracting, the economy is growing. We've been a huge push from the government to try and get the economy growing, because if the economy growing, everybody's lives feel better. And I have heard the economy described as a pie, and we all get a piece of the pie. And if the economy grows, then our slice of the pie gets a bit bigger. And if the economy shrinks, then our slice of the pie gets a bit smaller, and no one wants that.
No, exactly. I'm loving this pie analogy. Anything that's food related is great. But yeah, what that means is that the government is essentially always targeting some level of economic growth. That is pretty much always going to be on their agenda. And as you say, if we think of it as like a pie, the more generally that the economy is growing, the more we'll see with our own pockets and our own spending equally prosperous. Things will be looking relatively positive. So as you say, your slice of the pie will get that little bit bigger if the economy is also getting that little bit bigger. So it's a win-win, really.
Now, I have noticed over the last few years, there's been a lot of talk about people's different experiences of the economy depending on their age. There's been a lot of generational differences. So, a lot of people talk about the fact that younger generations maybe aren't enjoying the same kind of benefits that older generations had in times past. So are we all having very different experiences of the same economy?
I think inevitably everyone has their own unique experience depending on where in the country they live, for example, what the economic conditions are like there, but also, as you say, when they were born and therefore what economic conditions they faced at different stages of their life. Because if we think back to, for example, in the 80s, when interest rates were really high, the attitudes that those people had that were perhaps looking at taking a mortgage or buying a house will be very different to those that are looking to take a mortgage and buy a house now, where interest rates are a little bit different. But not only are interest rates different, things like how much house prices are versus salaries, and therefore how much big ticket items and small ticket items are. They all kind of form their own unique blueprint, if you like, set of circumstances that each and every generation will face. So I definitely think it's fair to say that different generations will have different experiences, and I think they'll have their own hang-ups and biases as a result of them as well.
One of the reasons that we wanted to talk about, just break down some of the terms that we're hearing at the moment, is because it has become conversation around the dinner table. And a lot of that is down to the fact that we have seen the cost of living go up. We maybe aren't talking about a cost of living crisis in the way we were a couple of years ago, but for a lot of people, their living standards have been eroded, and that is down to inflation. And I know one of the ways that the Bank of England always talks about combating inflation is through hiking interest rates. So what's the dynamic there? Because it sounds really complicated.
Yeah, it certainly does. And as you say, it's become table topics because it's something that we're all seeing when we go to the supermarket, and the price of eggs, I know that's been one that's popping up in the headlines recently, it's gone through the roof. So inflation is really simply just an increase in prices. And again, much like GDP, this is quoted as a percentage so that we can see month on month how much prices are going up. Now, they actually measure inflation with something called CPI, another acronym for you. And the CPI is just basically where they take a big basket of commonly bought goods and they check how much the prices are changing. So that's how they get the measure of inflation. Now, what we've seen recently, and I just mentioned it before, was that interest rates climbed because the Bank of England and many other central banks across the world as well have used interest rates to try and bring inflation back down. So the government normally targets, in the UK at least, around 2% of inflation. We want a little bit. We don't want none, but we want it to be at a manageable amount. But we've seen inflation in sort of 2022, 2023 shoot all the way up to almost 10%. So way beyond that 2% that the government wants. And one way to control this is with those interest rates. So the effect of that is two main things. Firstly, if interest rates are higher, then people get more for leaving their cash in the bank because the bank will give you a slightly higher rate of interest. So there's more incentive to leave your cash there and to not spend it. But secondly, loans, so think mortgages, business loans, become more expensive because normally they come with a rate of interest as well. So if the price of them goes up, then people also have less money to spend. So the dual effect of this, of raising interest rates, means that people are spending less, and then hopefully it helps to bring down the effects of inflation.
It's incredibly complicated, and everybody's experience will be different, as you say. But the reason that we wanted to talk about it now is because we are heading towards a budget. And that is the point where the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, effectively sets out how she is going to balance the public books. So a big set of books. So why is the state of the economy, how it's growing now, where inflation is now, where interest rates are now, why is that important when we start to consider what might happen in that budget?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she's got a big job on her hands, right? As you say, if we're all thinking about our own personal finances, we're probably in some way, shape or form thinking about balancing our own books. And she's got to do that for a whole country. And that's essentially what the budget is. It's her telling us, having decided how much they need to make as a government to try and keep those books balanced. So, for example, if the economy is generally stronger, what that means is that generally people are earning more. And what that means is that they're generally paying more in taxes. So more is coming into the government coffers, if you like. Now, that means generally that they don't need to assess tax rates, which I know is the talk of the moment. If the economy is shrinking, then they might see lower tax revenues coming in, which might mean that adjustments are needed because they've still got to plug the gap, if you like. They can't just necessarily keep borrowing money, and they have to find that money from somewhere to be able to fund public services and all the things that are going out of the government's wallet as well.
And I guess public services change, and how much money is spent on those public services change as well. And depending on the kind of service that we want, depends on whether more money goes in or less money goes in.
Yeah, absolutely. They're not fixed at all. Nothing is really in this world, right? And what we saw after COVID-19, for example, is that government spending really got pushed up. You might all remember, for example, the furlough scheme. And of course, that cost the government an awful lot of money. There's all sorts of other things going on within public services as well. There's the NHS. I know the big one that a lot of us talk about, and how expensive that is and how prices change. There's also, of course, defence as well, and what we've seen in recent years and how that might change with outgoings and spending that's needing to take place.
Okay, the thing that we also hear quite a lot about is her fiscal rules. What are they? Are they set in stone, or do they change?
Yeah. So the fiscal rules are just basically government promises about how they'll manage their borrowing and their debt. They're not set in stone. They do change, and they have changed, but they're supposed to show that the government is being in some way, shape or form responsible with money. More often than not, they're kind of tied in with the political optics of it, rather than it being something that is really tight, if you like, from an economic perspective. So it'd be things, as I say, around borrowing, debt and deficits, and what kind of percentage they want to stick to.
And I suppose that those numbers can move as well, depending on what period of time you're considering. And a lot of this decision making is graded almost by the government's spending watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility. So what part do they play in all of this?
Yeah, so they have an interesting role. It's kind of their job to check if the government looks like it's on track, but it's not really any punishment if those rules are missed or what they've set out isn't quite hit. Of course, they have an understanding that things change, and with the best will in the world, it can't necessarily be perfectly in line with what they said, but they do try and keep them more or less on track to hold tight to what it was that they said they were going to do, to also avoid any hugely negative impacts on the economy, for example.
You spoke about tax earlier on, and for a lot of us, we get our paychecks and we take a look at the amount that we would have earned before tax and the amount that we actually received after tax. And there is quite a difference. So how do we pay tax? Because there are different taxes, and what does that tax pay for?
Yeah, I think tax is certainly I think there's a phrase, isn't there? One of the inevitabilities of life, if you like. It's something that we all have to face. And there are lots of different types. I think the one that we'll most commonly see, and the one that you're referring to there, is probably on our income, which is income tax. Now, if you're employed, normally it will be deducted automatically for you. If you're self-employed, then it's your responsibility to handle it via filing a self-assessment tax return. And those taxes go to HMRC, to the government, and then they decide how they redistribute it. But there are other taxes as well. So there are taxes, for example, on properties. If you buy a property, a new one, old one, whether you're moving, you'll pay tax on that. But we'll also pay other taxes on things that we purchase, for example. VAT, you might have heard of. This is a tax that we don't often see. It's often in the UK not actually quoted, but it's built in to various different goods and services as well. There's lots of different types out there.
One thing that we keep hearing at the moment is that taxes are likely to rise, but we don't know what taxes might rise because there have been commitments, for example, not to increase the rate of income tax. But there is also something which is quoted in headlines quite a lot, which is called a stealth tax, or at least that's what many journalists would refer to, the freezing of tax thresholds. So just give us a bit of an idea about that, how it started, what it means, and if those thresholds are ever going to be unfrozen.
Yeah, this is it's a kind of clever way of the government to keep tax levels at the rate that they are, so that everybody believes that they're not going up, and they're not going up. But if you remember, we touched upon inflation just earlier, whereby prices are consistently rising. And when prices are rising, generally so are wages. So if we think of those income tax levels, if those thresholds don't rise, but wages do rise, then more people will probably end up paying higher rates of tax, even though the official threshold hasn't been lifted. It can also be known as fiscal drag. It's where they like to think of it as fiscally more people get dragged into higher brackets and higher levels of taxation due to inflation, essentially.
And I want to end with what seems to be the word of every day, which is tariffs. Essentially, that's just a kind of tax, right?
Yeah, it is. I don't think a day's gone by this year almost that we haven't said that word tariff, but it is. The tariffs that have been put in place mostly by Donald Trump in the US, and then other retaliatory tariffs from countries, are just putting a tax on the purchase of goods, services, or whatever else it is from those countries. Kind of like you might have noticed sometimes there are fees to pay on parcels coming from abroad. And it's like that on steroids, basically. It's higher levels of taxation on those goods coming in.
So I suppose just finally, people are concerned about the economy, but they're more concerned about their own experiences of the economy. And as we head towards the budget, it's quite easy to be gloomy.
Yeah, it really is. And I don't necessarily think the headlines always help us with that, because actually the economy is growing this year. We've seen economic growth in the UK, and we're still targeted to have growth in 2025 and into 2026. Now, it might not be quite as high as sometimes people would like it to be. And that can be the part that really gets blasted out, I think, across headlines. We don't know what she's going to do at the budget yet. It's essentially none of us have a crystal ball. We can't predict the future. So there's a lot of talk at the moment as to what she might change. But until we actually know, I personally think it's best to remain optimistic until that point and then deal with whatever comes on November the 26th.
Zoe, that's been great. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Zoe Burt there, who is co-founder of My Financial Freedom Coach. You can find her on Instagram at Words on Wealth. I think it's really helpful to go back to basics sometimes, isn't it? Because it's easy to just gloss over things or hear terms out there like you mentioned at the top, Danni, GDP, and just assume that we're meant to know what that means, what that stands for, and what that actually is. So I think very useful. But what I also want to know, of course, is did she have a confession?
She did. And you know what? It was a great one.
Oh, this is a good one. And it's a recent one for me, actually, and it's a bit of a silly one, but I'm sure it's one that many of us can relate to. Of course, we're making this just at the end of September. It's just been the summer. I was very lucky to be away quite a bit here and there over the summer, and we had a few weddings. It's been quite busy. And in that time, what I've managed to do is not refresh the app that is my credit card. Now, I personally use a credit card for a little bit of spending to keep credit scores healthy, but I make sure that I pay off my credit card each and every month. Now, I don't have a direct debit set up because normally I'm quite organised and I check in on it, but it seems that August ran away with me. We were busy, we were away, and because the app had gone into the little status of not being downloaded anymore, I wasn't getting notifications saying, hey, you owe us a bit of money, you need to pay the check. And I got into September thinking, oh, everything's doing quite well this month. I'm feeling quite flush. Only to realise, to my horror, that I'd not paid my credit card bill for the month. So I re-downloaded the app, checked in, and had to pay a small penalty because I paid it late by that point and missed the deadline. So I think that's my financial confession, a slightly silly one. Very cross with myself, kicking myself. Moral of the story is keep all your apps downloaded and keep on top of your finances. If it seems too good to be true, it is.
But that's the problem, particularly if you've been away and maybe you're downloading extra apps, map apps or whatever, and one of the ones that maybe you're not using because you're busy playing gets knocked off and you don't realise, and then suddenly, oops.
Exactly that. I think the moral of the story could be just set up a direct debit, but it's not something I'd done because, as I say, I'm normally quite organised and check in on it. But there you are. That's my confession.
That is one I've fallen foul of before as well. Us organised gals. If you forget, you go on holiday, you lose your mind, and then you forget to pay your credit card bill. I had a similar thing, and I now have set up a regular payment for the minimum amount at least, so that if I do forget, then that's at least covered.
I must admit, I did that immediately as soon as I opened my credit card because I can be incredibly forgetful and life just gets on top of you, you know? You can have a busy back to school period. My daughter's just gone off to university, so it's been absolute chaos and those kind of things slip through. So I do think that if you can make sure that at least you've got the minimum covered and then when you remember, pay off more, then that's great. That's all we've got for this episode. As ever, do get in touch with any of your financial confessions, questions, or just to chat. You can find us at AJ Bell Money Matters on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
And don't forget to let any friends and family who haven't discovered us yet know all about us. You can go to our website where you'll find lots of useful articles and, of course, this podcast. But you can also find this podcast wherever you listen to your other pods. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.
Before you go, please remember this podcast is for educational purposes, and the views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of AJ Bell. The podcast isn't telling you if a certain investment is suitable or not. Don't forget that the value of investments can change, and you can lose money as well as make it. It's also important to remember that how you're taxed will depend on your individual circumstances, and rules can change. The way an investment performed in the past may not be the same as how it behaves in the future. If you want help, go see a qualified financial advisor.